Okay, thanks, sorry.
All ready? Okay. So I was just saying that with this group, it's an honor to be with you because first of all, you already have the values as a ground for the change that's needed. So that's number one. And the second thing is you're all already actively involved, and that's amazing. So all I'm going to present tonight is hopefully one extra tool in your arsenal. So you already have a range of methods and tactics and strategies to do what you're doing, to protect the environment, to care for nature, to combat the climate crisis, and so on. So I hope that tonight, this could be one extra tool that you might find useful in what you're already doing. So for me, that's a wonderful starting point because we already have in common that you're already actively involved and that we share a value basis. So that's a good foundation to start with. So thank you for inviting me, and I'm really honored to be with you. So what I'll do is just, I think, give an overview of what this book is about. What's this all about? And maybe a starting point, which is also the beginning of the book, is just to talk about, I know people roll their eyes when you even say the word economics. There's something about economics that bewilders people, that overwhelms them, that makes them feel victimized almost. So somehow, instead of what you talked about just now as the center of our understanding, somehow the economy has come to play God in our materialist world. So the materialist world in which we live, we literally bow down to economists, to economic theory, to economic growth. So I think that we need to start with an acknowledgement of how is it that people are so stressed, overwhelmed by this thing that we call the economy? And to some extent, I blame economists for this because they've somehow used a jargon that enshrines them as the experts and that almost deliberately covers up the fatal flaws in the current system. So somehow this economic model that economists have touted, which is taught in universities, it's the model which universities teach, has become a kind of super system to which all else, the natural world, our communities, our families, somehow bow down. So without oversimplifying, I am hoping that the first part of this book actually starts out with talking just in plain language about how our present economic system actually works and how flimsy its foundations really are. So we'll just say a few words about that to start. So after that, I don't want to say that that's what the book is about because most of the book is actually about the way forward, how to have a saner way forward and how practically we can get there. And it describes the hands-on work that we've done over 25 years with 3 different governments to try to make that happen, starting here in Nova Scotia and actually going all the way to the United Nations. So I'll just say a few words about that journey, but I'll focus on this region since this is where we are. So at the base of economic policy making is what has been called, and I'm quoting now, the most powerful statistic in human history. That's the way it's described. What is that most powerful statistic in human history? That statistic is what's called gross domestic product, or GDP for short. In a nutshell, GDP is a single number that adds up how much stuff we produce and how much we buy and sell. That's what GDP does. So it's a completely materialist measure of our well-being. So just having the number is not a problem. And in the book, I actually explain why it's a handy number to have. But that calculation is not what makes it so powerful. The problem starts when economists and politicians think as they always do these days, that their main job is to make that number grow. They call it economic growth. So making that statistic grow, that's where the problem starts. So they then misuse GDP for a purpose its architects never intended. Namely, they use it to tell us if we're better off or worse off. So they assume, and this assumption is shared by politicians, economists, journalists, that more GDP and the faster you can make it grow is better, the better off we are. So to convince us of that, and journalists, by the way, fall right into this trap, you'll notice, they borrow words from the health profession to tell us that our economy is healthy if it's growing fast. And if it's not growing fast, they tell us it's weak, it's sickly. It's this assumption that more GDP makes us better off. That's where the problem starts. Now, interestingly, the Nobel Prize winning architect of GDP, Simon Kuznets, warned 70 years ago that GDP should never be used for the purpose for which it's used today. He said, if you want to know if we're better off, you have to ask what is growing, what we're producing, what we're buying, not simply the fact that it's growing. No one listened to him. I mean, if you think about it, anything can make GDP grow. More arms manufacturing, more war, more cigarette sales, more junk food sales, more drug and hospital bills, more crime that makes us spend more money on prisons, more pollution and natural disasters that make us spend money on cleaning up the mess. Anything can make the economy grow. So long as you're spending money, GDP will grow. And of course, the economists celebrate and the politicians celebrate. It's a completely materialist value that has very little to do with the beautiful introduction that you just gave. But does that kind of GDP growth really mean we're better off? Maybe the worst misuse of GDP is that it counts only what we extract from nature and what we sell in the market. It ignores what we actually leave behind, even though we totally depend on what we leave behind for our future well-being. So I think we're mostly older here. So most of us will remember the collapse of the Atlantic groundfish stocks back in 1990, when was it? 1992, right? We'll remember that. Right up to the moment that those groundfish stocks collapsed, the economists, the politicians, and the journalists were praising the fishing industry as a boom industry with its record fish landings, landing more fish than ever before. So that was celebrated in GDP. GDP only counted what we took out of the oceans, not what we were leaving behind. And the scientists who were warning of declining fish stocks due to overfishing were ignored by the economists and the politicians who were fixated on growth. We're doing the same today with our forests. GDP counts the timber that we extract and sell, and it ignores the declining and degraded forests that we leave behind. And it's no wonder that we can't, as a society, as a country, really act on climate change. After all, the more fossil fuels we sell, the more we burn, the more greenhouse gases we emit, the more the economy will grow. And that, of course, the economists celebrate. That's not all. You also talked in your opening remarks, thank you for that, about justice. So GDP will grow even if it's only the rich getting richer while the poor get poorer. While the middle class loses real income. GDP is just an average, so the rich growing richer can actually drive GDP up. So it doesn't tell us what the gap is between rich and poor. Is that getting bigger or smaller? It tells us nothing about that. And this actually has happened in Canada and in the United States and many other countries. GDP has gone up, economic growth has gone up, while the poor are getting poorer. So GDP is just an average. So they tell us nothing about the growing gap between rich and poor. There's actually an old joke among statisticians that if you put your feet in the refrigerator and your head in the oven, then on average, your body temperature will be just fine. So that's what an average does. But it doesn't tell us who's too hot and who's being left out in the cold. So it can't do that. Averages can't do that. So to know how well off we really are, we need to know who's on fire and who's being left out in the cold. Our economic growth statistics simply don't tell us that. There's something else though, and again, I want to come back to those beautiful introductory remarks you made, because for us here in the Maritimes, I think, and I know we have Newfoundlander with us, so in the Atlantic provinces, I think we can be proud enough to say that there are certain values that we hold here, which we're quite proudly of, and which those values that we still have in this region of the world, in this region of the country, they're not very well served by this most powerful statistic in human history. For example, here in Atlantic Canada, and we've crunched the numbers on this, we have the highest rate of volunteer work in the country. People caring for each other, caring for their communities, volunteering for the churches that you belong to. But GDP only counts work for pay. So all that unpaid work, all that voluntary work is invisible to our economists and our policymakers. So work that has genuine benefit to our communities is simply invisible, is ignored. And it's absurd because it's so absurd that actually the architect of GDP, Simon Kuznets, actually broke ranks with the United States Department of Commerce over their refusal to include the value of unpaid work in GDP. So, I mean, what's the absurdity? You look after your own child, you're worth nothing to GDP. Hire a stranger to look after your child, the economy will grow. It's good for the GDP, it's good for economic growth. Does that mean your child is getting better parenting from a stranger? Questionable. So there's a section in the book that I've spent just talking about how the failure to value unpaid work, particularly devalues the work of women who around the world do the vast majority of unpaid work. You may know of New Zealand economist Marilyn Waring, who really has made that issue forefront of her own work. I could go on. So when GDP grows, if machines replace jobs, so long as we're shopping, it grows, no matter how deep we're going into debt. I could go on with a list. Suffice to say that the book starts with what this most powerful statistic in human history is, what it does, and what it doesn't do, and how its misuse gives wrong information to policymakers, how it produces bad policy, and leads us down a deadly and dangerous path that now very seriously threatens our children's future. But this is important because this book is not a complaint. Once we know what's wrong, once we call out the deception that the economics profession has been perpetrating, then we actually know what to do about it. And that's the work of our last 25 years, starting right here in Nova Scotia, which is described in the book. So enough bad news. The good news. We do have ways of measuring progress properly and accurately and giving good information to policymakers. Now, we've called that the Genuine Progress Index. We're not the only ones in the world working on this. We're working with people in many different places who are also working on this. More than that, given the pervading materialist ethos, Counting it right is absolutely necessary for the value shift that we need. It's absolutely necessary to shape good policy. So I can say this confidentially to this little group, but what I'm hoping I can convey tonight is a little bit subversive. It's a way of using the language of economics to subvert that materialist ethos. Because we know that if we preach our values, we know that the economists and the hard-nosed people who pride themselves on being practical will shut it off. So this is a way of maybe using their language to actually demonstrate a different way forward. So the book points to that bigger picture all the way through. What is the real economic model that we actually desperately need that reflects our true values? Now, again, the good news is that we have all the knowledge, all the expertise, the resources, the good working models on which to build to create a genuinely secure, sustainable, equitable, and prosperous society and future for our children. We know what it takes. We know how to do it. We've got no excuse. We can't plead ignorance. We know what to do and how to do it. The architects of our present economic system at Bretton Woods at the end of the Second World War, maybe they could be excused. They didn't know that human beings were capable of depleting resources to the point of extinction, of killing off other species. They didn't know that human beings could actually change the climate of the planet Earth. So those who devised our economic system, the one we still have today, maybe can be excused. But today we have the knowledge to know that that economic system no longer works. So this book is also about the daunting challenges and also the letdowns we've had over the last 25 years and what we could do about it now. So I want to just, in the limited time we have, I want to give you a few examples of how we measure economic health accurately. And there are plenty more in the book. I'll just pick out a very few. So let's start with survival. Food. We need food to survive, let alone health. So let's start with farming. What GDP counts is what's called farm cash receipts, what farmers are getting from the sale of their produce. But it's called gross domestic product for a reason. It is literally a gross accounting system. It is not a net accounting system. What we don't know is how much it's costing farmers to farm. And when you look at the numbers in a way that GDP doesn't do and can't do, what we find is that farm expenses and farm debt are growing at a much faster rate, astronomically, way faster than income. So if GDP only counts their income, it completely misses the reality that farmers can actually no longer afford to farm. No wonder that small farmers are going out of business and selling their land. So we looked at Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and we crunched the numbers and we showed that over a 35-year period, net farm income was going down and down and down to the point of actually being literally below zero. So I have to say, when we released these numbers, the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture was actually ecstatic. They invited us over. They wanted us to present this. They said, we've been saying this for years, but we only had anecdotal evidence. At last, we've got the numbers to prove what we know. So we weren't telling them anything they didn't already know. All we were doing is giving them the statistics to prove that farm economic viability, especially for small farmers, was no longer reasonable in this region, that actually it no longer paid small farmers to farm. But no matter what we released, no matter what we told the government, the GDP stranglehold remained firm. So it didn't have to be that way. There was plenty of early warning signals. So had this net accounting system been used, it would have sent timely, early warning signals, plenty of space for remedial action before the fish stocks collapse, before small farms die out, before we're overwhelmed by the drought, fires, disease, and rising seas caused by catastrophic climate change. All the evidence that we needed on climate change was available 35 years ago. But meantime, our most powerful statistic in human history is only counting the growth of the economy, which includes more fossil fuel burning, more greenhouse gas emissions. So a gross accounting system cannot give policymakers the evidence they need to make good policy. So we use that net accounting system throughout our genuine progress index with climate change, transportation, health. I mean, there's examples, and I've got heaps of them here. But I can tell you this, that we proved with actual hard numbers that timely action to combat climate change from an economic point of view is way more cost effective economically than dealing with the damages of climate change down the road. All we're doing is deferring that cost to our children and our children's children. And that can be proved with hard numbers. There are ways of measuring this accurately to compare the costs of taking forthright action on climate change now with the costs of not acting. So this is the kind of work which we did in our Genuine Progress Index, and we used economic language to try to do it. By the way, I want to say this, that this is not true only of issues like climate change. In 2008, we released a report showing that for 80% of Canadians, debt was growing up at a much faster rate than income. People were going deeper into debt. Their income was going like this, their debt was going like that. For 20% of the population, the richest 20%, that wasn't true. Their income was growing way, way faster than their debt. But for 80%, so we said there's trouble on the horizon. We released that report 2008. Just before the crash came, we asked the head of one of Canada's most prestigious banks, I could name names, but maybe I'll be discreet or not. And we showed him this result. We said, so what do you think? There's trouble on the horizon here. If people's debt keeps going up faster than their income, sooner or later, they're not going to be able to make payments on their house, their car, and everything else. There's trouble here. He said, you've got to be wrong. Canadian household finances have never been more secure. They've never been better than they are today. This was 2008. We asked him to look at our calculations, at the data sources, at the numbers, at the way we reached the conclusions. He couldn't dispute any of it. He said, but your conclusion has to be wrong because things are so rosy. 2 months later, the crash came. Suddenly, we lost, in Canada, 400,000 jobs disappeared. Exports declined by 16%, investments by 22%. We weren't surprised. Any net system of accounting would have told the story. But economists are so blinded by their own system that they can only look at whether income is going up, regardless of the costs that are being sustained. So this is the approach we used across the board. We used it with transportation. We used it with forest inventories. We looked at all the old forest inventories to show the decline and degradation of our forests in this region. Basically, all of our old growth forests are gone. We calculated the decline in forest soils and habitat, carbon storage capacity, all of that. So this is what the Genuine Progress Index does. By the way, I should add a little anecdote, which is told in the book. The forest industry didn't like our results because it would mean that they'd have to change the way they were doing business. Instead of clear cutting the hell out of our forests, they would actually have to maybe move more towards selection harvesting and more sustainable methods of forestry. So they didn't They didn't like this, so they hired the most expensive accounting firm, KPMG, to do what they called a forensic audit of our report to try to discredit it. Actually, the Nova Scotia forest industry did this quite officially. And I have to say, I'm kind of pleased that they never issued, KPMG never issued a report. The Nova Scotia forest industry never said another word, because actually they couldn't prove our numbers wrong. They were accurate. We were using forest inventories. We were using all respectable Statistics Canada sources. So there was no way of actually disputing that. But it is threatening to business as usual. There's no question about it. So I want to say this again. This is the Genuine Progress Index is not just full of bad news about climate change and forests. On the contrary, it actually celebrates the values we hold dear right here. We do count the value of voluntary work. We count the power, and there are ways of measuring this. Statistics Canada has good data, how you can actually detail viable, prosperous, successful communities that hold together and are still strong and have community spirit. So all of these things, Statistics Canada now has a social capital survey. It gives wonderful numbers on this. What's your sense of belonging? What's your sense of trust? So actually, these are Statistics Canada numbers. So there are many things here which we can celebrate. Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island have bleeding edge waste management systems. We looked at the economic benefits of those waste management systems, that a sustainable waste management system can actually be justified in economic terms. We gave a presentation at the time to the Prince Edward Island legislature. We did a lot of work on the costs of secondhand smoke, and our work was used to bring into being the ban on smoking in bars and restaurants. So our GPI work was used for that, because we measured the true costs of smoking, the true costs of secondhand smoke in dollar figures. We actually found that we could save 25% of our current healthcare budgets if Nova Scotians didn't smoke, exercised regularly, had healthy weights. So basic preventative measures could actually save the healthcare system and save government lots of money. Now, those numbers, I have to say, in health was one area where government did listen. There were places they didn't, but health was one they did. And they actually, based on our numbers, they actually created a new Department of Health Promotion. And they actually created a proper, comprehensive tobacco control strategy, which hadn't existed before. And they created a nutritional policy for schools. So vending machines selling junk food were no longer allowed. So they actually used our numbers to make some changes in the health field, and actually to create a new department devoted to health promotion and disease prevention. You know what I'm talking about. The values that we have here are actually measured in our Genuine Progress Index. I mean, we all know it anecdotally. I don't own a car. And I have to say, I'm still, as a pedestrian, I'm actually touched. I'm moved every time that a car even thinks that I'm thinking of crossing the road, they stop. Okay, we might take that for granted, that kind of behavior that we still have here in the Atlantic provinces, that kind of something about it. But it's not the case most places. I've lived in quite a few places. We should not take that for granted. There is something here which our Genuine Progress Index, it's not all bad news. We actually value what matters, what really counts. That's part of the Genuine Progress Index too. We value community, health, environmental quality, basic security. And we, in some way, we still treasure the fact that there is more to the Maritimes and these Atlantic provinces than just making more money. It's not the only thing that matters here. Okay, I've got a lot of examples of this, and we don't have time to do them, but just one example of the impact it can have, just a little anecdote. We crunched the numbers. What if voluntary work, unpaid voluntary work, had to be replaced for pay? What would it be worth to the economy of Nova Scotia? We found $1.8 billion, a huge amount. If we didn't have that voluntary work, either our community well-being, the quality of life would go down, our churches would no longer have that kind of support that depends on volunteers, or that volunteer work would have to be replaced for pay. We looked at what would it cost to replace it for pay. So once we released the numbers, every year there's an annual Nova Scotia Volunteer of the Year award. And it's usually a feel-good affair with a nice dinner and they give an award. So this particular year, after we released these numbers, the volunteer organizations invited, at the time, Premier John Hamm on the stage, and they presented him with a check this big made out for $1.8 billion. And they said, Mr. Premier, here is our contribution to the Nova Scotia economy this year. And it has an impact. Using those economic numbers can actually change the atmosphere. It can raise the profile of things like volunteer work, of environmental quality that have been ignored and sidelined. Putting numbers to it can bring things that which are on the fringes of our current policy agenda to the front and center. So that's why I say it's a strategy. It doesn't replace the values that you talked about so beautifully at the beginning, but it's a way of using the language of our materialist ethic, our materialist system, to turn people's minds towards the values which have been sidelined and ignored. So I'm not going to give any more examples. I'm just going to, just to end, say a few words about, okay, now I've got to confess, I was very naive. I think we were all very naive. And by the way, not only we, but I think so were climate scientists. All of us number crunchers in the world somehow believed that if policymakers only had the truth, if they only had the evidence, then of course they'd say, oh, of course, we didn't know this. Now we've got the real numbers, now we know what to do. So we were really naive enough to believe that the truth talks and that it would actually affect policy. For 20 years, I firmly believed that all we had to do was present the real evidence, to show the numbers, to do it rigorously, using all respectable data from Statistics Canada, and the policymakers would say, oh, great, thank you. Now we'll use that. Now we know what to do. We were just getting the wrong information before. We weren't getting all the information we need. It hasn't happened. It has not happened. And it's not just, you know, us number crunchers here working on the Genuine Progress Index that have come to that realization. I think climate scientists throughout the world shared that belief too, that if they could only just tell the truth, crunch the numbers, and present them, that people would believe them. Okay, who believes them? Greta believes them. She's the one who these days quotes science, and she's the one who tells Davos and the United States Congress and the United Nations, don't believe me, don't listen to me, listen to what the scientists are telling you. So I want to acknowledge Gwen here, because Gwen saw this early on in our work. She created GPI Youth, because really it is our young people whose future we've stolen, whose future we've mortgaged. And we continue to live in our present lifestyle at their expense. And so the last part of the book is actually talking about what is a way forward. Now I describe in the book how we took this model. I was working in Bhutan for many, many years. And Bhutan actually took our Genuine Progress Index model, which aligned with their own values, to the United Nations. And at the United Nations, we had the Secretary General of the United Nations there. We had president of Costa Rica flew up. We had diplomats from countries around the world. We had Nobel Prize winning economists there. And it looked like the Secretary General of the United Nations said, the old system is broken, we need a new one. Very, very forthright. We had that hope until this meeting of the United Nations was 9 years ago. And at that point, there was still some we believed. But we're more sober today because we've come to realize that the truth doesn't talk. We never heard of this term, fake news. Actually, we've been fed a diet of fake news by the economics profession for a very, very long time. So what do we actually do? These days, the hope I have is in the young people. And I do want to acknowledge Gwen for seeing that way, way before I did. So in starting GPI Youth and training young people in this work, giving them the tools, I think that here we are, most of us are old, but I really think that that's the only place. When I heard Greta speak at the United Nations and Davos, I just followed her everywhere. Tears would just say, unadorned. She's listening. So I think that maybe we've been aiming our work at the wrong audience all of these years. We've been aiming it at policymakers, at the experts. And I think Gwen was right. We should be aiming really at our young people. They're the ones who are actually going to, because it's their future, they're the ones who are going to take this. I think we have to rethink our whole messaging. To whom are we talking? I don't believe anymore that we're going to change this political party or that political party. I really think we need to look to who the change makers really are. So there's a lot more to say, but I think that's enough to get a conversation going.